Welcome to SLUMBERVERSE! Oh gee, another dimension of naps!
Hey there, sleepyheads, glad to have you back. Before we slip into tonight's tale, I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from, and what time it is for you right now. In the valley where morning mist clung to the hillsides like whispered secrets, there lived a night that changed everything with the gentleness of a sigh. It was the evening when the great citadel of echoing dreams, perched on its distant hill like a patient guardian, first began to lean, not with the crash and thunder that stories usually promise, but with the almost imperceptible shift of something ancient learning to rest. The movement was so subtle that only the sleeping earth registered it, a gentle tremor in the heart of things, like the exhale of someone who had been holding their breath for centuries. In a cottage built from stones that once belonged to smaller, forgotten towers, a child arrived as this great settling began. The midwife, a woman named Alara, whose hands had welcomed hundreds of babies into the world, noticed something unusual as the labor progressed. The single candle she had lit began to burn with a steadier flame than she had ever seen, as if invisible hands were protecting it from every draught. The night air, usually sharp with mountain chill, grew strangely tender around the small room, wrapping itself like a soft blanket around the expectant mother. They named her Sage, though no one could quite explain why the name felt so perfectly right. Her grandmother Mira claimed it came in a dream, whispered by voices that sounded like wind through old libraries. Her mother simply said the name settled on her tongue, like something that had been waiting there all along. And there was something to understand about this child from her very first breath, a quality of attention that made restless animals settle, made anxious visitors find themselves breathing more slowly, made even the stones in the walls seem to lean in closer to listen. The house where Sage grew up held its own quiet magic. Her grandfather had built it decades earlier, from stones gathered throughout the valley, each one salvaged from towers and walls that had chosen their own time to rest. He had arranged them not by size or color, but by some intuitive sense of where each wanted to be placed, as if the stones themselves whispered their preferences. These weathered pieces of former grandeur seemed content in their new purpose, no longer reaching toward the sky but cradling a family with the wisdom they had gathered through years of standing tall. As Sage grew from infant to toddler, she developed an unusual relationship with these patient stones. She would press her small palms against the walls and tilt her head, her expression growing distant and peaceful, as if she were having conversations that only she could hear. Her grandmother, who had lived long enough to recognize unusual gifts, would watch from doorways and nod knowingly. The child wasn't just touching walls. She was learning the stories held within them, understanding their quiet satisfaction at having found their perfect resting places. By her third year, Sage could sense when things were ready to let go, not in a frightening way, but with a gentleness that made the process feel natural, even beautiful. She knew when the old apple tree behind the house was ready to release its heaviest branch, and she would sit beneath it, with a blanket spread wide, catching the limb as it settled down with a soft sigh of relief. She could predict when her grandmother's favorite teacup had grown tired of holding liquid, and she would be there with soft cloths to gather the fragments tenderly, arranging them in the garden where they could catch rainwater for the flowers. The villagers began to notice these small miracles of timing and grace. How Sage always seemed to appear just when Mrs. Chen's ancient fence post was ready to lean into retirement, providing gentle hands to guide its fall away from the prize roses. How she would show up at the bakery precisely when old Henrik's wooden bread paddle, worn smooth by 50 years of use, was ready to split along its natural grain, offering her small arms to receive both pieces with reverence. But it was during her quiet moments that the deepest connection revealed itself. On nights when mountain winds carried the faint echoing sigh of the distant citadel as it shifted another fraction of an inch, Sage would stir in her sleep. Her dreams were never of monsters or adventures, but of vast ancient spaces filled with soft light, of stones whispering stories, of buildings learning to breathe. She would wake with tears of recognition sliding down her cheeks, not tears of sadness, but of understanding that she was witnessing something both profound and achingly beautiful. Her grandmother would find her at the window some mornings, small palm pressed against the cool glass, gazing toward the eastern hills where the citadel stood in its eternal vigil. "What do you see, little one?" Mira would ask softly, and Sage would lean back against her warmth, still watching the distant structure, with the patient attention of someone who understood that the most beautiful changes happen slowly, gently, with the kind of care that makes endings feel like beginnings. "It's getting ready to rest," Sage would whisper, her voice carrying wisdom too large for her small frame. "It's been standing for so long, and now it's ready to become something new, something softer." And in those moments, as morning light painted the valley in shades of gold and rose, both grandmother and child knew that something magnificent was preparing to teach the world about the poetry of letting go. And somehow this gentle child was meant to be part of that transformative dance. The seasons turned like pages in a well-loved book, and Sage grew into her gift the way morning light grows across a valley, gradually, naturally, with the kind of patience that makes beautiful things possible. By her 6th year, she had learned to distinguish between the different stories that stones could tell, each one carrying its own particular melody in the quiet symphony of settled things. Her grandmother Mira became her first and most gentle teacher in this ancient art of listening. Unlike other adults who might have dismissed a child's claims of conversing with walls, Mira possessed the deep wisdom of someone who had lived long enough to recognize magic in unexpected forms. She had grown up in a family of builders and knew that the finest craftsmen always claimed their material spoke to them, guiding the placement of each beam and stone through something far more subtle than mere measurement. On afternoons when the light fell soft and golden through their kitchen window, Mira would sit with Sage on the smooth flagstones by the hearth, a small bowl of water placed between them like a sacred offering. "Watch how the surface trembles when the wind moves through the house," her grandmother would say, her voice carrying the warmth of fresh bread and old lullabies. "Stones breathe too, little one. They tell us when they're ready to loosen, the way a chest loosens before a deep, contented sigh." Sage would watch with the intense concentration of someone learning a new language, observing how the water shivered at the tiniest footfall, responding to the mute conversations happening within the walls themselves. She began to understand that their house possessed its own pulse, slow, patient, and deeply connected to the larger rhythm that rolled down from the Citadel's distant hill, the ancient cadence of standing gracefully into rest. These tower stones that formed their walls remembered what it felt like to reach toward heaven, to hold the dreams and ambitions of those who had built them into earlier grandeur. They spoke to Sage of years spent watching sunrise paint valleys in watercolor hues, of storms weathered with dignity, of the slow, sweet understanding that even the most magnificent structures were always meant to be temporary. Through decades of standing tall, they had learned that there was no shame in settling down when the time felt right. In fact, they whispered to her during quiet listening sessions, there was a particular kind of honor in choosing one's own moment to transform. "Your grandfather could hear them too," Mira told Sage one drowsy afternoon as they sat together in the garden, the child's small hands resting on a particularly talkative stone that had once been part of a lighthouse. He said each stone knew exactly where it wanted to be placed, and his job was simply to listen and obey. "That's why this house feels so peaceful. Every element found its perfect home." Sage nodded, understanding flowing through her like warm honey. She could feel the lighthouse stone's deep contentment, its satisfaction at having traded the lonely vigil of guiding ships for the intimate joy of sheltering a family. It had loved its years of standing watch over dangerous waters, but it loved even more this new purpose of holding up walls that contained laughter, bedtime stories, and the quiet conversations between grandmother and granddaughter on sleepy afternoons. As months passed like gentle exhalations, Sage's ability to sense when things were ready to transition grew more refined and tender. She learned to feel the difference between something breaking from neglect or violence and something simply ready to transform with dignity. The old garden gate, for instance, carried a different energy than Mrs. Chen's fence post had carried. Where the post had been weary and ready for retirement, the gate was still strong, but beginning to dream of different service. Sage could sense its desire to become a garden bench, to trade its duty of opening and closing for the pleasure of supporting people who wanted to sit quietly among flowers. During this period of gentle learning, the distant Citadel continued its almost imperceptible settling. Most villagers had forgotten about the ancient structure entirely, but Sage felt each tiny shift like a tuning fork resonating softly in her chest. Sometimes, on particularly still evenings, She would climb onto the roof of their house and turn her face toward the eastern hills, closing her eyes and simply listening with her whole being. The Citadel's voice was different from the tower stones in her walls, deeper, more complex, like a symphony compared to a simple melody. It spoke of centuries spent holding the dreams of entire civilizations, of libraries filled with books that smelled like vanilla and old leather, of workshops where artisans had crafted beauty from raw materials, of gardens where philosophers had walked among roses while contemplating the nature of impermanence. Sage began to have dreams during this time, not the fragmentary images that usually visit children's sleep, but complete vivid experiences that felt more like memories than imagination. She dreamed of walking through vast halls filled with soft, golden light, her footsteps echoing gently off stone floors, worn smooth by centuries of passage. In these dreams, she was always accompanied by a tall figure with silver hair and kind eyes, someone who moved through the settling spaces with the reverence of a person tending a beloved garden. She would wake from these dreams with her heart full of anticipation rather than anxiety, understanding somehow that she was being prepared for something important, not a battle or rescue, but participation in something infinitely more subtle and profound. The gentle art of helping magnificent things find their perfect way to rest. The tower stones in her walls would hum with approval during these morning moments of awakening, as if they too were part of the preparation, teaching her through their own contentment how beautiful it could be to trade one form of service for another, how redemption could arrive as softly as settling dust, as gently as the exhale of something ancient learning, finally, to rest. The dreams that visited Sage grew deeper with each passing season, like roots finding richer soil in the quiet depths of sleep. The silver-haired figure who walked beside her through those vast settling halls had begun to feel less like a stranger and more like an old friend whose name she had simply forgotten. In these nocturnal journeys, she learned to recognize the difference between the sigh of stone ready to rest and the whisper of wood dreaming of new purpose. Each morning she would wake with her small hands tingling, as if they had spent the night catching invisible things that fell like gentle rain. Her grandmother Mira noticed these changes with the patient wisdom of someone who had lived long, enough to recognize magic in its quieter forms. During their afternoon sessions by the hearth, she began teaching Sage not just to listen to the stones, but to understand the deeper language they spoke, the ancient vocabulary of things that had learned when to hold on and when to let go. Every structure dreams of its next becoming, Mira would say, her voice soft as worn velvet, while they sat together watching dust motes dance in the golden light. Your gift, little one, is helping them remember those dreams. She would place Sage's small palm against different stones in their walls, teaching her to feel the subtle differences, this one content in its current service, that one beginning to imagine retirement, another already humming with anticipation of transformation. It was during one of these gentle lessons that Sage first truly understood the scope of what lived within her. They had walked to the village square, where the ancient oak tree stood in its centuries-old vigil, and Mira had suggested they sit in its shade to practice listening. But as Sage pressed her hand against the deeply grooved bark, she felt something that made her breath catch, not the simple readiness she had sensed in fence posts and garden gates, but something vast and complex, like hearing a symphony where she had expected a single note. The oak was not dying, she realized with wonder. It was preparing to multiply itself, to transform from one magnificent presence into dozens of smaller gifts scattered throughout the community like seeds of comfort. She could feel its excitement about this transition, its deep satisfaction at having spent centuries reaching toward the sky and now being ready to embrace the earth in an entirely different way. The tree's heaviest branch, thick as a young oak itself, had grown weary from decades of holding its massive crown aloft. But unlike the anxious discussions she had overheard among the villagers about dangerous limbs and necessary cutting, Sage felt the branch's own gentle readiness to settle, its dream of becoming something that could cradle people instead of simply sheltering them from above. That afternoon, she asked her grandmother to help her gather the thickest blankets they owned. Together they spread them beneath the weary branch, like preparing a soft bed for a beloved elder ready to rest. Sage then did what felt most natural. She sat quietly beside the tree, her small hand resting on its roots, her breathing slow and deep as she synchronized her rhythm with the oak's ancient pulse. The villagers who gathered to watch expected either nothing at all or something dramatic. Instead, they witnessed something far more beautiful, the gentle art of perfect timing. 3 days later, just as the first light of dawn painted the square in shades of rose and gold, the branch released itself with a sigh so soft it sounded like contentment itself. It settled onto the waiting blankets with the grace of someone finally lying down after a very long, satisfying day of work. Sage woke immediately, as she always did, when something near her found its moment of transformation. She padded barefoot across the dewy grass to where the branch lay like a gift waiting to be unwrapped, and felt its deep peace at having found its perfect resting place. By the time the baker arrived to begin his morning work, she had already guided the branch into position against the stone wall of his shop, where it formed a natural bench perfectly positioned to catch the morning sun. Old Henrik discovered this addition with wonder rather than alarm, somehow understanding immediately that he was witnessing not destruction but evolution. Within hours, word had spread through the village with the kind of quiet amazement that accompanies truly beautiful surprises. People began gathering not just for Henrik's warm bread, but to experience the profound peace that seemed to emanate from the oak's gift. Children found that their morning lessons became easier when reviewed on the branch bench. Adults discovered that difficult conversations flowed more smoothly when held in its presence. Even the village cats began congregating there during their afternoon naps, drawn by something they couldn't name but clearly felt. Over the following weeks, more branches followed the first one's example, each finding its perfect moment and its ideal new purpose. A medium-sized limb became a natural bridge across the creek behind the schoolhouse. Another curved itself into a reading alcove in the library's garden, shaped just right for supporting someone's back during long afternoons with beloved books. The villagers began to understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented, not the death of their treasured oak, but its evolution into an even more intimate relationship with their community. They started calling Sage the keeper of quiet corners, recognizing her not as someone who predicted endings, but as someone who helped magnificent things discover their perfect way to transform. As autumn painted the valley in shades of amber and gold, Sage would sit among the oak's various gifts, scattered throughout the village, feeling the tree's continued presence in each transformed piece. The distant Citadel's slow settling continued to resonate in her chest like a second heartbeat, and she knew with the certainty that comes in dreams that her real work was only just beginning. The weeks that followed the oak's transformation settled into the village like a gentle blessing, each of the tree's gifts finding its perfect rhythm within the community's daily life. Children discovered that their morning lessons flowed more easily when practiced on the branch bench, their young voices mixing with the soft conversations of settling wood. Adults found that difficult decisions seemed clearer when contemplated in the reading alcove, as if the curved bark still held some memory of reaching toward light and could share that wisdom with anyone who leaned against it with an open heart. Sage moved through these transformed spaces with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had helped facilitate a perfect conversation between need and offering. But beneath this contentment, the distant resonance of the Citadel grew stronger each day, pulsing in her chest like a second heartbeat that belonged to something vast and patient and ready. Her dreams had begun to carry new details, the texture of ancient stone worn smooth by centuries of gentle touch, the particular quality of light that filters through windows learning to tilt toward new angles, the whispered conversations of walls that had decided to breathe more deeply. It was on a morning when the mist hung low in the valley, like a soft grey blanket, that the messenger arrived. Sage woke to the sound of steady footsteps on the path, accompanied by the gentle jingle of small bells that seemed to ring not with urgency, but with the quiet music of someone who understood that important things should be approached with reverence. She padded to the kitchen window, where her grandmother already stood with a cup of tea warming her weathered hands. "He's been walking for days," Mira said softly, her voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone she reserved for things that others might find impossible, but which she accepted as naturally as sunrise. "I've been dreaming of his arrival since the new moon. He carries letters, little one, letters that smell like rain and distant libraries, like the kind of ink that's made from crushed flowers and patience." The messenger proved to be a young man with dust-colored hair and eyes that held the particular depth of someone who had spent long hours walking through quiet landscapes while carrying precious cargo. He approached their cottage with the careful reverence of someone entering a sacred space, and when Mira opened the door before he could knock, he smiled with the relief of someone who had finally found exactly where he was meant to be. "I'm Marcus," he said, looking directly at Sage with recognition that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than sight. "I bring correspondence from Keeper Orion of the Citadel of Echoing Dreams." His satchel was made of soft leather, the color of twilight, and from it he withdrew a bundle wrapped in cloth that seemed to shimmer slightly in the morning light. "He said I would know you, by the way the stones grow quiet in your presence, and by the peace that settles in the air around you like dust finding its perfect resting place." The letters were bound with ribbon, the color of evening sky, and sealed, with wax that bore the impression of a tower settling gently into a garden. As Marcus placed them into Sage's small hands, she felt the papers themselves humming with anticipation, as if the words written upon them had been waiting years to find their intended reader. The weight was slight but somehow significant, like holding a sleeping bird or a handful of particularly meaningful stones. "Keeper Orion has been watching the same dreams you've been having," Marcus explained, accepting the cup of tea that Mira offered, with hands that trembled slightly from the profound nature of his errand. "He says the Citadel has been whispering your name in its sleep, calling to someone who would understand its readiness to transform into something new and beautiful." Sage broke the first seal with the careful reverence her grandmother had taught her to show toward all things that carried stories. The paper within was cream-colored and thick, with a texture that felt like it had been made by hand from flowers and tree bark. The ink was deep purple-brown, the color of crushed petals mixed with earth, and the handwriting flowed across the page like water, finding its natural course through a beloved landscape. "Dear Keeper of Quiet Corners," the letter began, and Sage felt her heart flutter with recognition at seeing her village nickname written in this elegant script. "I write to you from the highest room of our beloved Citadel, where I have spent years watching sunrise paint our valley in shades of hope and possibility. The structure that has been my home and responsibility is preparing for its next becoming, and I find myself in need of someone who understands the difference between ending and transformation." The words that followed painted pictures of things Sage had seen only in her dreams, vast halls filled with golden light that seemed to breathe with the rhythm of settling stone, libraries where books whispered their stories even when unopened, workshops where artisans had once crafted beauty from simple materials with the patience of people who understood that the most magnificent things take time to emerge. But more than describing physical spaces, Orion's words revealed the Citadel's emotional landscape, its deep contentment at having served its purpose well, and its growing excitement about the garden it was preparing to become. As Sage finished reading, she looked up to find both her grandmother and Marcus watching her with expressions of gentle expectation. The letters had confirmed what her heart already knew: the dreams, the resonance she felt with the distant structure, the growing sense of purpose that hummed in her bones like a tuning fork struck by invisible hands. The Citadel was calling not for rescue, but for partnership in the most beautiful dance of all, the dance of choosing when and how to let go with perfect grace. The second letter, when Sage unfolded it with the careful reverence her grandmother had taught her to show toward all precious things, contained not words but a map drawn in the same flower-petal ink. The lines flowed across the parchment like poetry made visible, showing not just the winding path through the eastern hills, but something deeper, the emotional journey that awaited someone ready to help a magnificent structure find its way to perfect rest. The map seemed to pulse gently beneath her fingertips, as if the path itself were alive and eager to guide her steps toward whatever waited in the distant hills. Marcus remained through the morning, sharing quiet stories, while helping Mira tend the garden where the oak's smaller branches had been arranged into raised beds for winter herbs. His presence felt like a bridge between the quiet life Sage had always known and the larger purpose that was beginning to unfold like morning light across the valley. He spoke of the Citadel with the reverence of someone who had witnessed something beyond ordinary understanding, describing how the building breathed with the patience of something that had learned to make waiting itself a form of prayer. That afternoon, As golden light slanted through their kitchen window, Mira began preparing for Sage's departure with the focused attention she always brought to important transitions. She wrapped a scarf around Sage's shoulders, light as cloud and smelling faintly of lavender and flower, the fragrance of home woven into each thread. Into a small traveling bag went clothes that would keep Sage warm during mountain evenings, a smooth stone from their own hearth that had grown patient with years of listening, and food wrapped in soft cloth, thick slices of bread, pale cheese, apple quarters, and 2 small sandwiches pressed together like old friends. To the bag's strap, Mira tied a tiny bell, not for warning but for remembrance. Its soft chime would keep Sage company when the wind grew thoughtful. "I've been preparing for this moment since you were small," Mira said, her weathered hands folding over Sage's where they held the precious map. "Not because I knew exactly what would come, but because I could feel your gift growing like a seed that would someday need more space than our little garden could provide." Her voice carried the wisdom of someone who had learned that love sometimes means helping those you cherish find their way to purposes larger than the spaces that first nurtured them. They left at first light, the valley still tucked inside its blanket of mist. Sage walked beside Marcus while birds practiced their morning scales from hedges and open fields. The path wound upward through terraces cupped by low stone walls, each stone familiar to her senses, even though her feet had never touched this trail. When the breeze moved, the tiny bell on her satchel answered with a sound like a memory found again, keeping time with their steady footsteps on the well-worn earth. Along the way, the world offered small invitations to practice her gift. At a roadside shrine, a single tile had begun to slide from the roof, its journey slowed by a strand of moss. Sage paused, placed her palm against the weathered wood, and listened with her whole being. The tile was ready not to shatter, but to rest in a new way. She cupped it as it came free, angled it to catch the morning light, then set it on the ledge below where travelers left wildflowers and folded notes. "It wanted to see faces up close instead of just sky," she explained softly, and Marcus nodded with the understanding of someone who had learned to recognize magic in its quieter forms. As they climbed higher, the landscape transformed around them. The forest thinned, giving way to rolling hillsides where wildflowers bloomed in the shadows of settling walls, their roots finding purchase in the rich soil that had gathered over centuries from crumbling mortar and fallen stone. These were not gardens cultivated in defiance of decay, but gardens that embraced transformation, finding beauty in the very act of change. Petals unfurled against surfaces that bore the gentle scars of time, their vibrant life a testament to the cycles of letting go and beginning again. The Citadel emerged from afternoon mist, not as the imposing fortress of old tales, but as a structure that had softened around its edges, its once sharp lines now blurred by time and the gentle work of settling. It seemed to breathe with the landscape, its towers leaning just so, its walls bowing gracefully inward, as if preparing to embrace the earth that had supported it for so long. On a wide, moss-covered terrace where the path finally ended, a figure waited, tall and silver-haired, with the quiet strength of someone who had learned to tend magnificent things with infinite patience. When Keeper Orion smiled, Sage felt the peculiar settling that happens when the mind finally recognizes what the heart has trusted all along. "Welcome, Keeper of Quiet Corners," he said, his voice carrying the warmth of distant thunder that promises gentle rain. "The Citadel has been awaiting your arrival. It has much to show you and much to teach." As he led her through a grand archway, whose keystone now rested a little lower than its builders had intended, Sage pressed her palm against the ancient stone and felt its deep contentment, the satisfaction of something that had served its purpose well and was now ready to discover what came next. Inside, the air carried the sweet scent of old stone learning to breathe differently, and Sage knew with the certainty that comes in dreams that her real work was finally about to begin. The Citadel's interior welcomed them with air that seemed to breathe alongside the ancient stones, carrying whispers of centuries spent holding dreams and sheltering hopes. Sage felt the building's contentment as they walked through corridors where afternoon light filtered through tall windows, painting golden pools on floors worn smooth by countless footsteps. Each surface hummed with the quiet satisfaction of something that had served its purpose well and was now ready to discover what came next. Orion, moved through these spaces with the reverent familiarity of someone who had spent decades learning to read the building's moods, his weathered palm trailing along walls that seemed to lean toward his touch, like old friends seeking comfort. "She speaks most clearly in the early morning," he explained, as they paused beside a window that now framed the valley at a slightly different angle than its builders had intended. The stones warm slowly, and as they expand they whisper their dreams of transformation. Some wish to cradle gardens, others to form bridges across streams. The oldest blocks speak of returning to the quarry where they were born, carrying stories back to their sleeping brothers. Sage pressed her palm against the wall beside the window and felt something she had never encountered before, not just the simple readiness of her grandmother's tower stones, but something vast and complex, like the peace of someone who had lived a full life and was ready to write the final chapters with grace and intention. But as she focused her attention, she realized her gift had deepened during the journey here. Where once she could only sense when things were ready to let go, now she could feel invisible threads extending from her fingertips, weaving themselves into a soft net of compassion around whatever was preparing to fall. "You are not merely an observer," Orion said, watching as a hairline crack in the wall seemed to relax under Sage's touch. "You are a weaver of soft landings. You calm the anxieties of things that are ready to let go, showing them the beauty in their own surrender." He led her to a circular chamber where dust motes hung in the light like patient stars, and gestured toward a small section of ceiling that trembled with the almost imperceptible readiness she had learned to recognize. Sage stood beneath it, slowing her breath until it matched the room's quiet pulse. She imagined threads of gentleness extending upward, creating an invisible cushion of understanding around the tired plaster. When the small piece finally released itself, it drifted down not with the harsh crack of breaking, but with the soft sigh of something finding its perfect resting place on a shelf that seemed honored to receive it. "Attention is a loom," Orion explained, as they moved to the Citadel's ancient gardens, where autumn leaves danced with particular intention. "Tenderness is the shuttle. What you feel becomes a fabric, and the world gladly rests upon it." Sage practiced with the falling leaves, learning to sense the precise moment each one was ready to release its hold, then guiding their descent with invisible threads of compassion until they settled not with harsh rustles, but with gentle kisses upon the earth. In the herb garden, where flowers long past their summer bloom stood with drooping heads, Sage discovered her gift extended to the subtle anxieties of things that clung too tightly to life. She would approach tired petals with the same gentle focus, offering them the invisible cushion of understanding until their grip softened and they drifted downward with serene grace, each one guided to its perfect final resting place. As evening painted the settling walls in shades of lavender and gold, Orion shared the deeper wisdom that had taken him 43 years to understand. "I came here as a young man convinced that my purpose was to maintain and preserve, to fight against time, and the natural desire of all things to rest. But the Citadel taught me that preservation and transformation could be the same thing. My job wasn't to prevent change, but to help it happen with dignity." Sage felt this truth settling into her bones like warm honey. When Marcus appeared on the terrace where they shared their evening meal, she noticed the slight tension in his shoulders, the way he carried some invisible burden that made his movements careful and guarded. Without thinking, she extended the same gentle attention she had given to falling leaves and tired flowers, imagining a soft ledge of understanding where he could rest whatever he carried. "I was late to a promise 2 winters ago," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of long-held regret. "I'm still holding it, and it's heavy." Sage pictured a sunlit window ledge within him, wide and welcoming. "Set it there for a while," she murmured. "Let the light take some of the weight." As Marcus closed his eyes and breathed deeply, his shoulders lowered, as if an invisible thread had caught what he carried. And Sage understood that her gift could cradle feelings as surely as objects. As night arrived without hurry, and they lit a lamp whose flame leaned like a sleepy ear, Sage felt the Citadel settling more deeply into its foundations, preparing for the night's quiet work of dreaming. Tomorrow, she knew, her real education would begin, learning to help something magnificent discover its perfect way to rest, one gentle thread at a time. The first dawn within the Citadel arrived like a gentle awakening from dreams too beautiful to abandon completely. Sage stirred in her small chamber as the earliest light touched the eastern windows, feeling the building around her stretch and sigh like someone rising from deep, restorative sleep. The stones beneath her feet hummed with warmth that had nothing to do with the sun's rays. This was the contentment of something that had spent the night settling more perfectly into its own dreams of transformation. Through her window, the valley lay wrapped in mist that moved like slow breathing, and she could hear the distant murmur of the village beginning its daily rituals. But here, within these ancient walls, time moved differently, measured not by urgency, but by the patient rhythm of stone learning to rest more deeply with each passing hour. Orion found her on the eastern terrace, where she stood with her palm pressed against a section of balustrade that had shifted during the night, leaning now with the graceful patience of someone settling into a comfortable chair after a long day of standing. "She speaks most clearly at sunrise," he said, offering her a cup of tea that steamed like captured morning clouds. "The stones have spent the night dreaming, and at dawn they whisper their dreams to anyone willing to listen." As they began their morning walk through corridors that curved slightly differently than they had the day before, Sage discovered that her gift had deepened during her first night within these walls. Where once she could only sense when things were ready to let go, now she could feel the building's emotional landscape as clearly as she felt her own heartbeat. Each room held its own particular mood. The library hummed with scholarly contentment. The kitchen radiated warmth even from its cold hearth. The great hall echoed with memories of celebrations and the quiet satisfaction of having hosted so much joy. "Listen," Orion murmured as they paused beside a wall that trembled with almost imperceptible readiness. "She's not falling apart, she's rearranging herself. Each shift is intentional, part of a grand design that reveals itself slowly, like a flower opening its petals one at a time." Sage pressed her ear against the warm stone and heard something that made her breath catch. Not the groaning of structural failure, but something that sounded remarkably like a lullaby, deep and resonant and infinitely peaceful. The Citadel, she realized, was singing to itself as it settled, each small shift creating notes in a vast, slow symphony of transformation. The foundational stones provided the deep bass notes, thrumming with centuries of patient strength, now softening into contentment. The wooden beams added higher melodies, their ancient grain creaking not with strain, but with the satisfaction of weight finally being redistributed in more comfortable ways. Even the smallest fragments of mortar that occasionally released themselves contributed delicate chimes, like distant bells celebrating each moment of graceful letting go. As days flowed into each other with the gentle rhythm of tides, Sage and Orion developed their morning ritual of walking and listening. They would move through the slowly transforming structure, like pilgrims visiting a sacred site, their footsteps soft on floors worn smooth by centuries of passage. Sage learned to read the subtle language of settling stone, understanding the difference between a wall that was simply aging and one that was actively preparing for its next becoming. In the great library, where books leaned against each other like old friends sharing secrets, she discovered that her threads of gentleness could ease more than just physical transitions. Ancient volumes whose bindings had grown tired of holding their pages in rigid formation would release individual leaves into her waiting hands, each one drifting down with the soft flutter of something finally free to rest. She learned to catch these literary fragments with invisible nets of tenderness, understanding that knowledge, too, sometimes needed to transform its shape in order to remain alive and accessible. "Everything here teaches us about honorable transitions," Orion explained one afternoon, as they watched a climbing vine release its hold on a tower wall, not from weakness, but from readiness to explore what lay beyond vertical ambition. The vine settled across the terrace like a green river, its leaves catching sunlight in patterns that seemed more beautiful for being unexpected. The Citadel isn't dying, it's demonstrating how magnificent things can choose their own perfect moment to transform. As evening painted the settling walls in shades of lavender and gold, their walks took on a different quality. The building's lullaby grew softer, more intimate, as if the Citadel were preparing for sleep by sharing its deepest dreams. Sage found herself moving in rhythm with these gentle songs, her own breathing synchronizing with the ancient pulse that flowed through stone and timber alike. During these twilight hours, she began to understand that her role was not to prevent the Citadel's transformation, but to help it happen with the dignity and grace that such a magnificent structure deserved. Her gift was becoming a bridge between what was and what was ready to become, offering comfort to things that were learning to let go and ensuring that nothing fell without being caught by invisible hands woven from pure compassion. As they paused beside a window that now framed the valley from a slightly different angle than its builders had intended, Orion smiled with the deep satisfaction of someone who had found his perfect student. "Tomorrow," he said softly, "I want to show you the heart of the Citadel, the place where all these transformations begin." His voice carried the reverence of someone about to share a sacred secret, and Sage felt the building itself lean closer to listen, as eager as she was to discover what lay at the center of this beautiful, slow dance of letting go. The morning that followed carried the soft promise of revelation in its mist-touched air, and Sage woke with the peculiar anticipation of someone about to discover a secret that had been patiently waiting to be shared. She found Orion on the eastern terrace, where he stood with his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of tea that steamed like captured dawn clouds, his silver hair catching the early light as he gazed toward the valley below. "The heart chamber has been preparing for your visit," he said softly, his voice carrying the reverence of someone about to share something sacred. "It speaks most clearly in the morning hours, when the stones have spent the night dreaming and are ready to whisper their deepest truths to anyone willing to listen with their whole being." He led her through corridors that seemed to breathe more slowly than usual, past windows where light pooled like liquid gold on floors worn smooth by centuries of gentle passage. The door to the heart chamber stood slightly ajar, as if the room itself had been listening for their approach and was eager to welcome them inside. When Orion pushed it open with the careful reverence of someone entering a place where ordinary rules bent toward something larger and more mysterious, Sage felt her breath catch at the beauty that waited within. The circular chamber curved upward into shadows that felt infinite rather than confining, its walls made of stone so perfectly fitted that they seemed to have grown together through centuries of patient conversation. At the center of the room, a simple wooden chair sat beside a small table holding a single candle, whose flame burned with unusual steadiness. But what made Sage's heart flutter with recognition was something else entirely. Suspended above a wide, shallow bowl of water hung a smooth stone, held by braided cords that had been worn soft by time and gentle use. "This is where the Citadel speaks most clearly," Orion explained, as he settled into the chair with the familiarity of long practice. "Every morning I come here to listen. The suspended stone responds to even the tiniest shifts in the building, touching the water and sending ripples outward that carry the Citadel's dreams beyond these walls and into the valley below." As if summoned by his words, the stone brushed the water's surface with the gentleness of a kiss, creating circles that glided outward in perfect patience, each ring carrying something that felt like contentment made visible. Sage approached the bowl and felt the invisible threads that had become so familiar extending not just from her fingertips, but from her entire being, weaving themselves into the room's atmosphere, until she became part of the vast network of attention that held the Citadel in its gentle embrace. For the first time, she could feel the building's complete emotional landscape, not just individual walls or rooms, but the entire structure as a single complex being, with its own hopes and dreams and quiet wisdom. The Citadel's voice, when it came, was like hearing the ocean from inside a seashell, vast and intimate simultaneously, carrying stories of all the lives it had sheltered, all the dreams it had protected, all the moments of joy and sorrow and quiet revelation it had witnessed from its patient vigil above the valley. But beneath these memories, Sage felt something that made her heart overflow with understanding, the building's deep excitement about its approaching transformation, its eagerness to discover what it could become when it was no longer bound by the necessity of standing tall. "She dreams of becoming a garden," Orion said softly, his eyes closed as he listened to whispers only they could hear. "Not just any garden, but one that grows from love itself, where every flower carries the memory of a kindness witnessed, every tree springs from the root of a friendship nurtured within these walls. She wants her stones to cradle new life, her timber to support climbing roses, her foundations to become the fertile ground where beauty can flourish in ways she never imagined while she was reaching toward the sky." As they sat in the gentle rhythm of the stone's soft kisses upon the water, a small section of the chamber's wall began to whisper its own readiness. Sage felt it like a tuning fork resonating in her chest, not urgent or alarming, but simply ready, like someone who had finished a long, satisfying conversation and was prepared to rest. She extended her threads of gentleness toward the tired mortar, imagining a soft bed of understanding where the small stones could settle with dignity. When the moment came, it happened with such grace that it felt more like witnessing a flower opening its petals than seeing something fall. 3 small stones released themselves and drifted into Sage's invisible net of compassion, settling onto the chamber floor with soft sighs of completion. The suspended stone responded by touching the water with particular tenderness, sending ripples that seemed to carry news of this gentle transformation outward through the building and beyond. By afternoon, Marcus had arrived at the Citadel's gates, the tiny bell from Sage's traveling bag chiming softly from his belt. "I felt something change in the air," he said simply, his dust-colored hair catching the golden light. It felt like an invitation. Behind him came Mrs. Chen, her palms still smelling of garden soil. And they gathered on the terrace where Orion served tea that tasted like mountain herbs and patience. As evening painted the settling walls in shades of lavender and gold, they sat together listening to the Citadel's lullaby, understanding without words that something beautiful was beginning, not just the building's transformation, but the gathering of souls who would help guide its graceful journey from standing guard to embracing the earth with equal love. Dawn arrived like a gentle exhale from the valley below, carrying with it the soft promise of transformation continuing its patient work. Sage stirred in her chamber as the first light touched the eastern windows, feeling the Citadel around her breathe more deeply than before, as if the building had spent the night dreaming of gardens and had woken refreshed by visions of its own becoming. The stones beneath her feet hummed with warmth that spoke not of structural strain, but of deep contentment, the satisfaction of something that had found its perfect audience for the most important performance of its long life. She found Orion on the western terrace, where he stood with Marcus and Mrs. Chen around a simple breakfast spread on weathered stones. Steam rose from cups of mountain tea, while thick slices of bread waited beside pale cheese and small sandwiches pressed together like old friends. The tiny bell from Sage's traveling bag chimed softly from Marcus's belt, its voice adding gentle percussion to the morning's quiet symphony. "More have come," Mrs. Chen said softly, gesturing toward the winding path where figures moved through the mist with the unhurried pace of people who understood they were being invited to witness something sacred. Old Henrik appeared first, his weathered hands carrying a basket that smelled of fresh bread and patience. Behind him came the village librarian with books of poetry tucked under her arm, and 3 children who moved with unusual reverence, their pockets bulging with acorns and smooth stones they had gathered as offerings. As the morning unfolded like pages in a well-loved book, the gathering took on the quality of a festival designed by silence itself. People arrived not with tools for preservation or prevention, but with soft blankets and patient hearts, understanding intuitively that their role was to help something magnificent discover its perfect way to rest. They brought instruments that whispered rather than shouted, wooden flutes that harmonized with wind through ancient corridors, small drums that echoed the gentle pulse of settling stone. The first transformation of the day announced itself through the suspended stone in the heart chamber, which began touching the water with unusual frequency, sending ripples outward that carried news of readiness through the building's ancient network of attention. Sage felt the call in her chest. A section of the eastern wall had spent the night dreaming of becoming something closer to the earth, something that could cradle rather than simply shelter. She approached the weathered stones with her palms extended, feeling the invisible threads of gentleness unfurling from her fingertips like silk catching morning light. The wall section trembled not with structural failure, but with anticipation, like someone preparing to lie down after a very long day of standing guard. Marcus and 2 of the arriving villagers spread thick blankets beneath the ready stones, creating a landing as soft as a nest prepared for something precious. When the transformation came, it happened with such grace that it felt more like witnessing a flower opening its petals than seeing something fall. The stones released themselves with soft sighs of completion, settling onto the waiting blankets with the dignity of elders, finally accepting their comfortable chairs. Each piece found its way into Sage's invisible net of compassion, guided not by gravity alone but by the gentle intention that had learned to make endings feel like beginnings. Mrs. Chen moved among the settled stones with the intuitive wisdom of someone who could see gardens where others saw only rubble. "This curve wants herbs," she murmured, her weathered fingers tracing the natural arc formed by the largest pieces. "Rosemary here, where the morning sun will warm the oils. Thyme along this edge, where feet will brush it and release its fragrance." The children helped arrange the smaller fragments, their young hands understanding without instruction how to create borders that felt both intentional and natural. By afternoon, what had been a rigid wall standing in eternal attention had become a gentle cascade of herb beds and reading alcoves, each element positioned with the precision of something that had found its ideal resting place. A carved window frame, released from its centuries-long duty of framing distant views, now created a sheltered nook where sunlight filtered through its empty space like golden thoughts made visible. The old gargoyle head, freed from its high perch, settled beside a natural depression where rainwater gathered, its carved mouth now offering a gentle stream for birds to drink. As evening painted the settling walls in shades of lavender and gold, the community gathered in what had once been the Great Hall, now open to the sky where a section of roof had gracefully accepted its time to rest. Orion shared bread and stories, while the Citadel's lullaby grew softer around them. The ancient song now accompanied by the gentle splash of water through the gargoyle's mouth and the whisper of wind through transformed spaces. "Every ending teaches us about beginnings," Orion said, his voice carrying the warmth of distant thunder that promises gentle rain. "But only if we approach it with the right kind of attention, the kind that sees beauty in transformation rather than tragedy in change." Children nodded with the wisdom of those who had spent the day helping magnificent things find their perfect way to rest, their small hands still tingling with the memory of catching falling stones with invisible nets of tenderness as stars emerged in the darkening sky, and the community settled into evening routines of quiet conversation and soft music. Sage felt the profound peace that comes from participating in something larger than oneself. The ancient art of helping beautiful things discover their perfect way to become gardens, one gentle transformation at a time. The evening that followed settled over the transformed spaces like a gentle blessing, carrying with it the soft satisfaction of work done with love and attention. As the last visitors made their way down the winding path, their footsteps lightened by the day's quiet miracles, Sage found herself drawn to the western terrace where Orion stood gazing out at the valley below. The tiny lights of distant homes twinkled like earthbound stars, each one holding its own stories of things learning to rest and transform. "There's something I need to share with you," Orion said softly, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had grown cool while he waited for the right moment. "Something I've carried for 43 years, waiting for someone who would understand its true meaning." He gestured toward a simple wooden bench that had once been part of the great hall's ceiling, now settled into its perfect purpose of supporting quiet conversations under starlight. As they sat together, the Citadel's lullaby humming gently around them, Orion reached into his traveling satchel and withdrew a leather-bound notebook, its cover worn soft by decades of careful handling. "A ledger of release," he said, placing it between them with the reverence reserved for sacred things. Not blueprints for construction, but for the opposite. Notes on how to invite grace into gravity, how to help magnificent things discover their perfect way to rest. Sage opened the book carefully, feeling the invisible threads of her gift respond to the wisdom contained within its pages. Each sheet held detailed sketches and elegant handwriting, diagrams showing how to mix mortar with crushed chamomile so it would relax rather than crumble, drawings of support beams designed to ease their own settling, maps of where to place blankets so they caught falling stones with reverence rather than mere practicality. Some pages held pressed flowers, their colors faded but their essence preserved, like botanical prayers for gentleness. "But this is the deeper truth," Orion continued, his voice carrying the weight of revelation long held in careful silence. "I didn't build the Citadel to last forever, standing rigid against time like a mountain defying erosion. I built her to teach, to demonstrate that even the most magnificent structures can choose their own perfect moment to transform, and that redemption can arrive as softly as morning mist settling into valleys. As his words sank into the quiet night, Sage felt something profound shift in her understanding. Every crack she had sensed preparing to breathe, every beam dreaming of becoming a garden bench, every stone ready to cradle herbs instead of supporting walls, all of it had been intentional, designed with the same care that other architects put into creating permanence. I studied the ancient oaks, Orion explained, his eyes reflecting the gentle light of stars emerging overhead. I watched how they release their branches when the time feels right, not from weakness but from wisdom. I observed rivers changing their courses, carving new paths not in defeat but in continuous becoming. The Citadel was meant to embody that same fluid understanding, strength that knew when to yield, beauty that could transform without losing its essential nature. During the days that followed this revelation, the community that had gathered around the Citadel's transformation grew with the natural rhythm of something beautiful, attracting kindred spirits. A family of weavers arrived from the eastern mountains, their cart filled with wool dyed in colors that seemed to hold captured sunlight. They understood without explanation that their role was to create soft landings for things learning to rest, spinning threads that would catch falling fragments with the tenderness of clouds embracing rain. The village blacksmith came with his apprentice, carrying not hammers for destruction, but gentle tools designed for persuasion rather than force. They crafted delicate supports that helped weary beams settle gracefully, creating temporary bridges that allowed the Citadel's transitions to happen with dignity rather than suddenness. Their work required a different kind of strength, the patience to help things find their own timing, rather than imposing human schedules upon ancient rhythms. As autumn painted the valley in deeper shades of amber and gold, Sage's gift evolved beyond anything she had imagined possible. The invisible threads that extended from her fingertips had become something more complex, an entire web of attention that could cradle not just individual stones, but entire sections of the slowly transforming structure. She learned to read the emotional landscape of rooms preparing for their next becoming, understanding which spaces were ready to open themselves to sky and which still needed time to whisper their final secrets to familiar walls. In the library, where books had begun releasing individual pages like autumn trees shedding leaves, she discovered that knowledge itself sometimes needed to transform its shape to remain alive. Pages that came loose settled onto her invisible nets with the soft flutter of something finally free to travel, each one guided to the hands that needed its particular wisdom most. One morning, as Marcus returned from carrying invitations to neighboring valleys, he brought news that made the suspended stone in the heart chamber ring with unusual clarity. "People are asking," he said simply, "how to help their own beautiful things find their way to rest. Word has spread of what you've learned here. Not just about buildings, but about the art of gentle endings." As evening painted the settling walls in shades of lavender and gold, Orion shared the final piece of his long-held wisdom. "My redemption," he said, his voice soft as a lullaby, "was not in keeping her standing forever. It was in understanding that my greatest act of love would be to help her full well, to design her transformation as carefully as I had designed her construction." That night, as stars emerged in the darkening sky and the community settled into evening routines of quiet music and soft conversation, Sage felt the profound anticipation that comes before the most important moments. The Citadel's lullaby had grown deeper, more complex, like a symphony adding new instruments to its gentle chorus. She knew with the certainty that comes in dreams that the building was preparing to teach its final, most beautiful lesson about the art of letting go with perfect grace, one gentle transformation at a time. The morning of the ceremony arrived with the gentle reverence of something sacred unfolding, the sky painted in shades of robin's egg blue, touched with whispers of rose and gold. There was no thunder, no dramatic crack of stone, but a quiet hush that settled over the valley like a blessing, as if the very air understood it was witnessing something unprecedented. This was not a day of mourning, but of profound gratitude, a celebration of transformation embraced with perfect grace. From every direction, people ascended the winding path with footsteps light with purpose. They carried gifts that spoke of new beginnings rather than endings, baskets of wildflowers gathered from dew-kissed meadows, smooth river stones polished by patient currents, small clay pots filled with seeds of plants that thrived in the shelter of gentle giants. Children moved with unusual reverence, their pockets bulging with acorns and drawings of what they imagined the garden might become, their young imaginations already weaving futures from ancient forms. Sage stood on the western terrace beside Orion, feeling the Citadel's emotional landscape shifting around them, like tides responding to an unseen moon. Her invisible threads of gentleness had evolved beyond anything she had imagined possible, extending now not just from her fingertips, but from her entire being, weaving a vast luminous net of compassion over the entire structure. She could feel every whisper of readiness, every sigh of stone preparing to release, every beam dreaming of its next, softer purpose. The suspended stone in the heart chamber had been touching the water with increasing frequency since before dawn, sending ripples outward that carried messages of readiness through the building's ancient network of attention. When Orion appeared beside her, his silver hair catching the morning light, his weathered face carried the serene expression of someone who had been preparing for this moment for 43 years. "She's ready," he said simply, his voice carrying the warmth of distant thunder that promises gentle rain. Not just a room or a wall, but the heart itself. The central tower dreams of becoming a gentle hill where children can climb grassy slopes instead of stone stairs, where flowers can grow from soil enriched by centuries of patient stone. As the community gathered in what had once been the Great Hall, now partially open to sky, where sections of roof had already begun their graceful descent, the ceremony began not with speeches, but with collective listening. Sage closed her eyes, centering herself in the building's ancient pulse, and the entire assembly followed her lead, their breaths synchronizing, their hearts opening to the subtle symphony of settling stone. The first profound transformation came from the highest tower, the sentinel that had watched over their valley for centuries. Sage felt its deep contentment, its readiness to embrace the earth after so many years of reaching toward heaven. With her entire being, she extended her threads of gentleness, creating not a net to catch but a soft cushion of understanding to guide. The tower began its slow, deliberate descent with a long, resonant sigh that vibrated through the ground beneath their feet, settling into the valley floor with the grace of a giant finally lying down to rest. Its stones dispersed outward like petals from a colossal flower, forming the beginnings of a vast circular garden bed. The blacksmith and his apprentice moved forward with their gentle tools, guiding larger pieces to ensure each found its perfect, stable resting place. Mrs. Chen followed, her weathered hands already envisioning where rosemary would catch morning sun, and time would release its fragrance under footsteps. Throughout the day, the Citadel continued its majestic dance of letting go. The old observatory leaned gracefully into a crescent of natural steps facing the valley, its brass telescope ring settling at the terrace edge to become an arch for future roses. Sections of walls curved inward to form intimate amphitheaters, their stones angled to catch sunlight and embrace quiet conversation. The great library softened its rigid corners, its shelves becoming curved reading nooks where books could whisper their stories to new generations of listeners. Children spread blankets and cushions with the focused attention of those who understood they were participating in something both ancient and unprecedented. Their young hands worked intuitively, creating soft landing places, not just for stones but for the profound emotions such moments could carry. Adults moved with equal reverence, some playing wooden flutes that harmonized with wind through settling spaces, others beating small drums that echoed the gentle pulse of structures learning to rest. As afternoon light slanted through the valley, painting everything in amber and gold, Sage moved through the transformations like a quiet architect of compassion. She helped a tired cornice find its purpose as a bird bath, guided a heavy lintel to become a bridge over a newly formed stream, ensured that each fragment, no matter how small, found its way into meaningful service within the emerging garden. When evening painted the transformed landscape in shades of lavender and gold, the community gathered not in a hall but beneath open sky, surrounded by beauty that had emerged from graceful ending. They shared bread and cheese and fruit, their conversation a gentle murmur, their hearts full of shared understanding. Where a proud structure had once stood, now lay a magnificent garden, whose contours still echoed former grandeur but breathed with new, softer life. The Citadel's lullaby continued, softer now but no less beautiful, rising from the very earth as a song of gratitude for a life well lived and a transformation gracefully embraced. It whispered of the profound beauty found in choosing to become something new and gentle, one loving, intentional release at a time. In the months that followed the ceremony, as seasons turned like pages in a well-loved book of transformations, the garden that had emerged from the Citadel's graceful settling became something far more profound than anyone had imagined. What grew from the ancient stones was not just a place of beauty, but a living school where people came to learn the most sacred of arts, the gentle guidance of honorable endings. The garden did not announce itself as a place of learning. It simply breathed with such profound peace that visitors found themselves naturally slowing their steps, deepening their attention, opening their hearts to possibilities they had never considered. Paths shaped by fallen lintels curved among beds of thyme and rosemary, and alcoves formed from softened arches invited conversations that did not need to hurry. Every morning, dew collected in the shallow basins of former capitals, and birds drank where sentry gargoyles now kept patient watch at ground level. Sage found herself at the heart of this quiet revolution, her gift having evolved into something that touched not just structures and objects, but the very nature of how communities approached change itself. The invisible threads that had once extended only from her fingertips now seemed to emanate from the garden itself, creating a vast network of compassion that helped visitors understand their own readiness to let go of what no longer served their highest becoming. They came from valleys near and far, these pilgrims of gentle transformation. Word of the ceremony moved through distant communities, with the unhurried certainty of weather, carried by Marcus, who had established himself as a different kind of messenger. He would arrive in villages where factories had closed with bitterness, where traditions had died with resentment, where changes had been imposed rather than embraced. His presence brought the possibility that even difficult transitions could be approached with the tenderness that made letting go feel like coming home to oneself. The first informal class gathered under the crescent of steps that had once been the observatory, drawn by a felt invitation rather than any formal announcement. Sage stood where a wall had decided to bow into a teaching curve and placed a small bell on the stone before her. "We'll use this," she said, her voice a warm whisper, "not for order but for attention. When it sings, we return to listening." Her lessons were never lectures, but shared experiences woven into the garden's daily rhythms. She would guide visitors' hands to touch a section of wall that had chosen to become a low bench, teaching them to feel the subtle contentment of stones that had embraced their transformation. "The secret," she would explain, "is to listen not just to what is falling, but to what it wants to become. Every ending carries within it the seed of a new beginning if we only offer it the space to grow." Lila arrived with a red scarf and a history of departures that had felt like storms. Her hands shook the first time she stood beneath a piece of plaster that had begun to dream of the earth. Sage guided her breath, stood beside her, and imagined a cradle big enough for fear itself. When the plaster released, it came down like a sigh discovered at last. Lila laughed, then cried, then laughed again, understanding for the first time that endings could feel like relief rather than loss. A young man named Rowan came late in the season, a widower whose voice carried the hush of rooms where someone is missing. He brought a broken watch he had not been able to part with, and sat by the gargoyle fountain until twilight. Sage did not ask for the story. She set the bell between them and let the fountain speak with its gentle murmur. By nightfall, he had taken the watch apart, fitting its delicate gears into a wind spinner that moved gently whenever the garden breathed. He told her quietly that he still didn't have words for his loss, but the garden had understood. Mrs. Chen had become the keeper of the herb gardens that spiraled outward from where the great tower once stood, her weathered hands teaching visitors how plants, too, understood the art of graceful release. "Watch the sage," she would say, her voice soft as morning mist as she guided someone's fingers to touch leaves that released their fragrance only when ready. "It holds its essence until the perfect moment, then gives it freely to whoever needs its gift." The children who had witnessed the ceremony became the school's most intuitive teachers, their young hearts still close enough to wonder, to recognize when adults were carrying things too heavy for their spirits. They would approach with the natural gentleness of those who had learned that helping things rest was an act of love, offering to hold invisible burdens while grown-ups learned to breathe more freely. As winter painted the valley in shades of silver and white, the school's reputation spread through networks of whispered gratitude. People spoke of a place where endings felt like blessings, where the weight of carrying what no longer served could be set down with dignity rather than defeat. They described a garden that had grown not just from ancient stones, but from the understanding that all beautiful things were meant to be temporary, and that this impermanence was not tragedy, but the very source of their preciousness. Orion moved through these spaces with the deep satisfaction of someone whose life's work had exceeded his most hopeful dreams. His ledger of release had become a collection of books, each one filled with stories of gentle endings that had blossomed into beautiful beginnings. As spring prepared to return to the valley, bringing with it the promise of new growth emerging from soil enriched by transformed stone, Sage felt the profound peace that comes from participating in something larger than individual understanding. The ancient, ongoing work of helping the world remember that endings and beginnings were simply different notes in the same eternal song of becoming. The years that followed flowed like gentle water, finding its perfect course, each season bringing new pilgrims to the garden that breathed with the wisdom of transformed stone. Sage's hair, once dark as midnight soil, began catching threads of silver that gleamed like captured moonlight, and her hands grew weathered from years of guiding gentle endings with infinite patience. The invisible threads that had once extended only from her fingertips now seemed to emanate from her entire being, creating a vast network of compassion that touched not just individual hearts but entire communities. Learning to embrace change as a sacred art, the school that had emerged so naturally from the Citadel's graceful settling had become something unprecedented, not an institution built from ambition, but a living demonstration of how wisdom could grow from the soil of beautiful endings. Students arrived not as empty vessels waiting to be filled, but as gardens ready to discover what wanted to bloom within them, when the weight of carrying unnecessary burdens was finally, gently set down. Marcus had established a network of quiet messengers who carried news of the school through distant valleys, but their invitations were never urgent announcements. Instead, they shared stories that settled into listeners' hearts like seeds waiting for the right season to sprout. His satchel now held small, smooth stones from the Citadel's heart, each one imbued with the calm energy of patient transformation. He would place these stones in the hands of those who felt overwhelmed by change, offering them a tangible reminder that even the grandest structures could learn to rest with dignity. Rowan, the widower who had learned to transform his grief into wind spinners that moved with the garden's breathing, traveled to communities struggling with loss. His gentle presence became a beacon for those who felt trapped in endings that refused to yield to new beginnings. He taught them to craft beauty from forgotten memories, to create small fountains from tears, showing them that even the most profound absences could be reimagined into presences of a different kind. Lila, whose red scarf had once mirrored the fiery passion she brought to every perceived ending, found her calling in helping others embrace the natural cycles of creation and release. Her hands, once prone to trembling, now moved with steady confidence as she guided people to understand that true beauty often lay in the impermanence of things, in their willingness to transform and become something unexpected. In the heart chamber, now open to sky where the roof had learned to embrace the earth, the suspended stone continued its ancient work of touching water and sending ripples outward. Each morning, Sage would sit beside the shallow pool and listen to the whispers carried on those expanding circles, tales of factories that had closed with bitterness, learning to become community gardens, of traditions that had died with resentment, discovering new life as stories shared around evening fires. The students who came to learn the art of honorable endings brought their own gifts to the evolving wisdom. An elderly potter taught classes on letting clay find its perfect form without forcing. A young musician showed how melodies could resolve with gentle cadences that left listeners feeling complete rather than abandoned. Their family of weavers demonstrated how threads could be released from one pattern to create another, their looms singing soft songs of transformation. As autumn painted the valley in deeper shades of amber and gold, Sage began to feel a familiar stirring in her chest, the same gentle readiness she had learned to recognize in walls preparing to breathe, in branches dreaming of the earth. But this time, the sensation arose not from something outside herself but from within, like a tuning fork struck by invisible hands in the quiet chambers of her own heart. She shared this recognition with Orion during one of their evening walks among the transformed spaces. His hair, now almost entirely white, seemed to glow in the soft light. "I feel it too," he said softly, his voice carrying the warmth of someone who had learned to greet even profound changes as old friends returning after long journeys. "The school no longer needs us to tend it. It has learned to grow from its own roots." One afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent, painting the transformed landscape in hues of amber and gold, Orion found Sage sitting by the gargoyle fountain, her eyes closed, a faint smile playing on her lips. "They carry your wisdom," he said, his voice soft as a lullaby. "They carry the garden into the world, one gentle ending at a time." Sage opened her eyes, their depths reflecting the quiet wisdom of 1,000 sunsets. "And you, Orion, you gave them the blueprint, not for a building but for a way of being. You taught us that true strength lies not in resistance, but in the art of honorable dissent." He nodded, his gaze sweeping across the transformed landscape. "My redemption was in understanding that the greatest act of creation is often in the graceful act of letting go. I built her to stand, but I designed her to become a garden." As twilight painted the valley in shades of lavender and deep indigo, Sage felt the profound satisfaction that comes from a life lived in harmony with the deepest rhythms of the world, understanding that her own transformation was approaching with the same gentle patience she had learned to offer all, beautiful things ready to discover their next becoming. The evening of long shadows arrived, not as a sudden curtain call but as a slow, deliberate lengthening of twilight across the valley, painting the transformed garden in hues of lavender and deep indigo. Sage sat on the bench that had once been part of the Citadel's great archway, her silver hair catching the last golden light like captured moonbeams, her weathered hands resting peacefully on stone worn smooth by centuries of patient service. The years had etched lines of wisdom around her eyes, but the depth of her gaze held the same quiet wonder it had possessed as a child, listening to the whispered stories of settled stones. The garden around her breathed with the soft contentment of a dream fully realized. Where the proud central tower once stood, a gentle hill now rose, its slopes covered in wildflowers that swayed like thoughts made visible. Children's laughter drifted from where they played among the former ramparts, now low curving walls that invited exploration rather than defiance. The gargoyle fountain murmured its eternal song, offering its gentle stream to thirsty birds and quiet reflection. As evening deepened, her students gathered with the natural reverence of those who understood they were witnessing something sacred. Marcus arrived carrying wildflowers from distant meadows, the tiny bell from Sage's old traveling bag chiming softly from his belt. Lila brought her red scarf, now faded to the color of sunset, and Rowan offered wind spinners that would carry memory on every breeze. Mrs. Chen appeared with herbs bound in soft twine, their fragrance mingling with the evening air like prayers made tangible. Orion joined them, moving through the transformed spaces with the peaceful awareness of someone completing a long, satisfying conversation. His weathered hands carried the leather-bound ledger, its pages now filled not just with architectural wisdom, but with the emotional geography of a community that had learned to approach change as sacred art. "Tonight," Sage said softly, lifting the small bell and letting it breathe a single note into the gathering dusk, "we practice the art of staying near." Her voice carried the warmth of all the lullabies that had ever helped magnificent things learn to rest. Not every ending asks for action. Some request witness, some ask for the warmth of company. They sat together as stars emerged like distant candles lit by invisible hands, their hearts synchronized with the gentle pulse that still emanated from the transformed stones. Orion placed the ledger between them with reverence. "Leave late enough to bless the room," he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "Early enough to spare it longing." His eyes reflected the profound peace of someone who had found his perfect moment to rest. Sage felt the familiar stirring in her chest, not urgency or anxiety, but the same gentle readiness she had learned to recognize in walls preparing to breathe, in branches dreaming of the earth. Her own life, she realized, had been a kind of citadel, standing strong when needed, sheltering dreams, weathering storms, but always preparing for its own graceful settling. She thought of her grandmother Mira, whose soft hands had first taught her to listen to the language of settling stones. She remembered the ancient oak that had learned to multiply itself through gentle release, the village that had discovered beauty in transformation. Every face came to mind like fireflies at dusk, those who had arrived carrying heavy things and had found here a gentle space to set them down, to allow them to become something new and soft. "The garden will remember," she said, her weathered hands touching the stone beneath her with infinite tenderness. Every stone that settled with dignity, every beam that became a reading bench, every wall that chose to embrace the earth. They hold the wisdom now, and they will teach it to anyone willing to listen with their whole heart. As the night deepened around them, Sage felt her consciousness beginning to expand beyond individual awareness, merging with the vast network of compassion she had spent her life weaving. The invisible threads that had once extended from her fingertips now seemed to emanate from the garden itself, creating a luminous tapestry that would continue to catch falling things with infinite tenderness long after her own transformation was complete. In these final moments of individual awareness, she felt not sadness, but profound gratitude for the privilege of having helped magnificent things discover their perfect way to become gardens. For having learned that redemption often arrived as softly as settling dust, as gently as the exhale of something ancient finally, peacefully learning to rest. The garden continued its quiet breathing around the gathered community, holding them in the same embrace of understanding that had once cradled falling stones and tired beams, whispering the eternal truth that all endings were also beginnings, all farewells also invitations to discover new forms of presence and love. The evening of long shadows arrived like a gentle benediction across the valley, painting the transformed garden in hues of lavender and deep indigo that seemed to breathe with their own inner light. Sage sat on the bench that had once been the Citadel's proud archway, her silver hair catching the last golden rays like captured moonbeams, her weathered hands resting peacefully on stone worn smooth by centuries of patient service. Around her, the garden exhaled the day's warmth, releasing the mingled fragrances of thyme and rosemary, of earth that had learned to cradle rather than simply support. The community gathered with the natural reverence of those who understood they were witnessing something sacred, their movements unhurried, their voices soft as evening prayers. Marcus arrived carrying a small basket woven from willow branches, the tiny bell from Sage's old traveling bag chiming softly from his belt with each gentle step. Inside the basket, wrapped in linen that smelled of distant hearths and patient hands, were thick slices of bread still warm from the oven, pale cheese aged in mountain caves, and 2 small sandwiches pressed together like old friends sharing secrets. Lila approached with her red scarf draped over her shoulders, the fabric now faded to the soft color of sunset clouds, its edges worn gentle by years of comfort, given and received. She settled the scarf around Sage's shoulders, with the tenderness of someone who had learned that the smallest gestures could carry the weight of entire conversations. Rowan placed one of his wind spinners at the garden's heart, where the great tower once stood, its delicate metal catching the evening breeze and turning with whispered songs of memory transformed into music. Mrs. Chen appeared with her weathered hands full of herbs bound in soft twine, rosemary for remembrance, thyme for courage, sage for wisdom, their fragrances mingling with the evening air like prayers made tangible. She arranged them on the stone beside Sage, with the reverence of someone placing offerings at a sacred shrine, understanding without words that this was both ending and beginning, both farewell and eternal welcome. Orion joined them last, moving through the transformed spaces with the peaceful awareness of someone completing a long, satisfying conversation with an old friend. His weathered hands carried the leather-bound ledger, its pages now filled not just with architectural wisdom, but with the emotional geography of a community that had learned to approach change as sacred art. He placed it gently on the stone between them, its presence a testament to all the gentle endings they had witnessed together. As stars emerged like distant candles lit by invisible hands, Sage felt the familiar stirring in her chest, not urgency or anxiety, but the same gentle readiness she had learned to recognize in walls preparing to breathe, in branches dreaming of the earth. Her own life, she realized with profound peace, had been a kind of citadel, standing strong when needed, sheltering dreams, weathering storms, but always preparing for its own graceful settling into something new and soft. "Tonight," she said softly, lifting the small bell that had traveled so many miles to find its way home, We practice the art of staying near. Her voice carried the warmth of all the lullabies that had ever helped magnificent things learn to rest. The single note that emerged hung in the air like a star, choosing to stay low for company. And in its gentle resonance, the entire gathering felt their hearts synchronize with the ancient pulse that still emanated from the transformed stones. She felt her awareness beginning to expand, not outward into the vastness of space, but inward into the very heart of the garden, into the quiet wisdom held within every stone that had learned to become something new. The invisible threads that had emanated from her being for so many years didn't disappear, but seemed to weave themselves deeper into the garden itself, becoming part of the eternal network of compassion that would continue to catch falling things with infinite tenderness. In these moments of gentle transition, Sage felt not sadness, but profound gratitude for the privilege of having helped magnificent things discover their perfect way to become gardens. She thought of her grandmother Mira, whose soft hands had first taught her to listen to the language of settling stones. She remembered the ancient oak that had learned to multiply itself through gentle release, each transformed branch finding its perfect new purpose in service to the community. When her own moment of settling arrived, it came with the same quiet grace that had characterized the Citadel's transformation, not as defeat, but as completion, not as ending, but as the perfect moment to join the eternal conversation between what was and what was ready to become. She didn't fall so much as settle, like the Citadel had taught her, like all beautiful things do when their time for standing has gently ended. Her transformation happened with such grace that it felt more like witnessing morning mist settling into valleys than seeing someone depart. The community remained in peaceful witness, understanding without words that Sage had not left them, but had simply changed the form of her presence, becoming part of the garden's breathing, part of the wisdom held in every transformed stone. The gargoyle fountain continued its eternal murmur, now carrying in its gentle song the echo of her teaching that redemption often arrived as softly as settling dust, as gently as the exhale of something ancient, finally learning to rest. In its patient voice, future visitors would hear the whisper that all endings were also beginnings, all farewells also invitations to discover new forms of presence and love. As dawn painted the valley in shades of rose and gold, the garden breathed more deeply, its capacity for holding difficult transitions expanded by the profound example of someone who had lived her entire philosophy in her final moments. The wisdom she had woven into the very fabric of the transformed spaces would continue to teach anyone willing to listen with their whole heart that the most beautiful changes happened not through force but through the patient cultivation of conditions that allowed magnificent things to discover their own perfect timing for rest. And somewhere in that eternal garden, on quiet evenings when the light turns golden and the air tastes like possibility, you can still hear the echo of gentle falls, the whisper of things choosing their own time to transform, the soft lullaby of structures that found their redemption not in standing forever, but in teaching the world how beautiful it can be to let go with perfect grace, one patient breath at a time. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay.